Hello and welcome to the end of 2022. And as is usual at this time of year, it's time to review all the books that I have read in the year and rank them as we used to do, if you recall, about 2 or 3 years ago before this became something of a dead meme. Anyway, I'm keeping it going and it looks something like this. So every book that I've read will fall into one of these 6 categories. L stands for literary, it's a cut above the standard, but also perhaps something that should be worthy of study, not just reading. It is reserved for just a handful of genuine classics that you then have standard A, B and C passing grade. D and F is for those absolute turkeys, usually reserved for putting books by Sarah J. Maas in that category. But I'm pleased to report that in 2022, I didn't read anything by her, and that warms my cold, black heart. However, we did begin 2022 on what would be very difficult to refer to as a high note, because the first book that I read was Jeffrey Deaver's James Bond book, Carte Blanche, notable only for being really, really dull, for having excessive product placement, and just not being worthy of the names Bond or Deaver. So that goes straight into the F, and what a way to start a year. The second book that I read was Robin of Sherwood, a TV tie-in with a series that was on ITV back in the mid-80s, I think, possibly. No, I think it was a bit later, because I think it was released to sort of cash in on a renewed interest in Robin Hood after the Kevin Costner movie. So I think it might have been in the early 90s. The book, I mean, you can never accuse it of lacking pace, given that it tries to encapsulate an entire series of a TV show in what is probably about 90 to 100 pages. So it absolutely blitzes through, but it adds nothing really to the TV series. And in fact, is almost a detraction because it covers so little. So that goes into the D. Then we moved on to Lost Fleet, which was by Jack Campbell, which was recommended to me by my friend Ramsey over at Rajathon. If you're not subscribed to his channel, I do recommend it. Decent modern science fiction. You can understand that if that series was to improve from this point, you can really understand why it has had the success it had. However, it didn't really do anything for me beyond being just a generally average science fiction, so I'm putting that into the C category. The fourth book that I read was another tie-in, this time with a movie, perhaps one that does not enjoy a particularly good reputation. It is the novelisation for Grease 2. However, I quite like Grease 2, the movie. It is most definitely a guilty pleasure, but the book actually has some of those things that were cut from the series, and also tries to just build a little on what the movie gave us. So actually, I think that Grease 2, the book, is actually a really good example of a film novelisation. It even tries to encapsulate something of the songs, though obviously that's really difficult to do in the novel format. But I actually quite like Grease 2. However, let's not kid ourselves, as fun as it is not exactly a masterpiece. So that's going in C as well. And the fifth book of the year, which, as you can see so far, is not exactly filling those top tiers, was Glass House by Rachel Caine. And absolutely a dismal effort, really poorly written, no semblance of any understanding of the 3-act structure of Freytag's Pyramid in terms of a character growth. Just a dreadful book. And what's really starting to become apparent as you read books of that style is that publishers have zero respect for the average female reader, and this is why they put this rubbish out for them. And if you read Rachel Caine, if you read Bella Forrest, you'll see that these books are the same, and everyone is the same. It doesn't even matter who writes them. Very similar as well. You could include Sarah J. Maas with that. They're just the same drivel, no real story, but that's not the point of them. The point of them is to get 5, 10, 15 books published in a year, nickel and dime those customers that you have, and just get every little penny that you can from the repeat business of those few fans that you've actually managed to find. However, you don't deserve even those, to be honest with you, not with the standard of this material. So Glass House goes straight into F, a really dismal effort, one to be avoided rather than recommended. And we move on then to something that actually is quite good, which is not surprising given that it's called The Very Best of Robert Heinlein, which is a collection of short stories. It's not a novel, but it does have some of his more famous work in there, particularly The Man Who Sold the Moon, which is a really, really good example of his style and quality. So this one, though it's titled The Very Best of, that's obviously just publishers trying to cash in. It goes into B. Way back in January and February, we were quite excited. Well, I was quite excited about the idea that the Division 2, the Tom Clancy game, which I play quite a lot, more than I probably should, had a second novel tie-in being released to try and regenerate some interest. I don't think that there was like a huge wave of new content for the game, but there was some. And there was another book published a few years back when the game was released, which was called Broken Dawn. In anticipation of the second book, I went back and read Broken Dawn. It's really not very good. It goes into the D. Not only does it jump too much between the two sites of the two games, but it also tries to just do far too much and ends up just being a bit of a mess, really, and not very good or very exciting. Because of that, I actually then didn't read the new book as it was coming out. I was kind of like, yeah, I can live without that. So Broken Dawn, I'm afraid. Subpar is going in D. 8th book of the year, which was Dinosaur Planet by Anne McCaffrey, which was an altogether more solid effort. However, it suffered in comparison to another sort of terraforming, exploring new worlds book, The Legacy of Hero by Larry Niven, which I'd read the year before. It simply isn't as good. It is, however, on its own right, worth your time. So it goes into the C. It's not brilliant, but it's certainly not bad. The next book was Goodbye California by Alistair MacLean, which, I don't know, I find Alistair MacLean, though obviously certainly in the UK, he's more famous, I think, than Desmond Bagley, perhaps because he just continued on a little bit more into more modern eras. Bagley died in the early 80s. But I find that Bagley is really consistent in that anything you pick up is pretty much a solid read, whereas MacLean sometimes, perhaps even better than Bagley, or certainly up there with the best of, and at other times really kind of substandard. But Goodbye California, not one of his better efforts. I don't think that anyone would call it that, but I did really quite enjoy it. I thought that for the time it came out, it was a bit of a return to form for him, and I'm going to put that into B. And then I read Eric Van Lustbader's Sunset Warrior, which I absolutely loved. It was at that point by miles the best book that I'd read in the year. Definitely worthy of going into A. Like really strong prose, great story, fabulous world. Initially, my one concern, because it was part of a trilogy, and obviously having really enjoyed the first book, I was thinking, oh, I'm definitely going to check out the next one. But there was a little bit of worry for me in that once they'd got out of the enclosed world at the beginning, that claustrophobia, that limitation that necessarily imposed on the world building, it started to become a little bit more generic. However, I was still quite excited about the second one and would still highly recommend this one. I think that you could kind of read it on its own. Early in the year, I was working in a school library, and this series of books, the Murder Most Unladylike books, were extremely popular with particularly the girls of the school. Didn't see a lot of boys reading them, but because it was so popular, I thought I would check it out for myself and see what the fuss was about, and actually found it to be a very enjoyable, if somewhat slight, murder mystery. Could have been a lot better on that regard, but there was a lot to like about the two leads. I could really understand why particularly young girls were enjoying it, so I'm going to put that into C. It's easily worthy of that, and I think that a lot of people will think that it should be higher. The next book I read, which is by far my most reviewed video of the year, which I don't know, it's kind of like a double-edged sword for me, because it's Will Jordan's Redemption, which is genuinely not a good book. It is not well written. It is not exciting. It's really far too long. Didn't particularly like the female lead especially. And to be honest with you, I think that most of the people that have seen that review are kind of looking for that negativity towards it, and there's only one or two that have come into the comments that were like defending it. I definitely don't want to pick a fight with a critical drinker whose channel I'm a subscriber to and I enjoy his content. I'm absolutely not interested in having a go at him or anything like that. So it's just, I really feel that it's a really poor book. And I was really surprised that it lacked any of the charm or wit that I associate with him when I see him on YouTube. The next one I read was The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, absolute classic. But I feel like once you have, I mean, it's called The Time Machine, but anytime you have a time-travelling plot, you open yourself up to all sorts of questions about why didn't you just do this? And that's particularly true of the fact that the girl, what is it, Winder or something like that, he abandons her and she's killed by the Morlocks. And then he goes to the future, and then when he's coming back, he could quite easily stop off and not leave her to die, and he doesn't. And then, I mean, as it's got some interesting things to say about politics. H.G. Wells' politics are pretty well known, I think. But yeah, it's a very enjoyable and likeable book. Perhaps controversially, I'm putting it in B. And what might make that seem more controversial is that my next book, The Death of Grass by John Christopher, also known for writing the Tripod series, I'm putting in A because I really, really enjoyed it. This was that 50s British science fiction, like some of the best that you would expect, I think, in just like a little bit of something to say about mankind, but also that genuinely exciting story about people who are starting to see that darkness creep back into their lives as the civilization crumbles around them. Really enjoyed it, highly recommend it. No qualms whatsoever about putting in A, which is probably where most people will expect the next book to go as well, because the next book is The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. The one thing about it is, like last year I reviewed Rebirth, also known as The Chrysalids, and gave that the A bracket. And the one thing that I would say about this one is that the sitting around talking of it is more excessive in the Midwich Cuckoos than there was in Rebirth. There is that guy that comes out, or I think it's a lady actually, that comes at the end of the Rebirth and then explains what's going on and why, and has a little bit of Wyndham's soapbox, but that is very much like confined to the last chapter, and what goes before that is just really, really, really good. Probably fantasy until you realise that it's sort of post-apocalyptic. Whereas the Midwich Cuckoos, phenomenal concept, mystery is really good, gets very British in the way they do it. We simply won't talk about it, old chap. And then there's a lot of talking at the end. So it isn't quite, I think, to the standard of Rebirth, and that's why I'm putting it in B and not A. But it is a very, very good science fiction book and highly recommended anyway. Most of what I read this year, I think, would be described as science fiction by most people, and this was Snow Crash, which I read again after watching Ramsey's review of it. I was like, okay, but what he was saying sounded really intriguing, and at the same time wasn't especially complimentary about the book. But listening to how intriguing he said it was, I was thinking, do you know what, this must be more than what he's saying. He's sort of playing down some aspects of it. Obviously go watch his video, but when I read it, I mean, he just nailed his review. Everything that he says in that video, I would agree with to an extent. The one thing that I would say about it is that what he's talking about as like being a genuine high, I would say was just like, yeah, it was decent. I'm probably not even good, and the things that he said were not good. He absolutely was right about. So that's why I'm putting Snow Crash. I'm going to put it in C for now, but I might revisit and drop it down to D later on, because it's just, you know, you look at the books in D, like Robin of Sherwood is not significantly worse, but Broken Dawn probably is. I'll think about it. Move on to the next one. Random Acts of Senseless Violence by John Womack, which I saw while I was shelving in the library. That's just putting books on shelves. You know, I was going through, putting books up, and I saw that title, and I saw that it was a science fiction, like Master Edition or whatever they're called. So they tend to be decent books if they're in that collection. And I was like, this looks like a good book. And then I read the back, and I was like, okay, this seems really good. Great title for hooking me, and I think that a lot of people would look at it and go, well, what's that about, and not pick it up. But I was absolutely intrigued, and I read it, and it it was, as the cliche goes, extremely difficult to put down. Extremely difficult. I was absolutely hooked. One thing perhaps I disliked the last chapter. Did not quite like that ending. But everything up to that was phenomenal. Just a real sort of turning up the steam all the time, getting more and more and more exciting. Yeah, really, really good. Highly recommended. Going straight into A easily. Some of you may know that I also have worked as a school teacher and have done so as recently as, what month is this? This is December, so October was the last time I actually worked in a school. And one of the books that I've seen kicking about in schools but never taught was Das for Zoe. Das for Zoe is written by Robert Swindells, who also wrote Stone Cold, which is another book that you almost certainly will read in an English school if you go through years 7 to 12. It's very commonly given to years 8 or 9. This is less commonly given, but it probably applied to that same year group. It's post-apocalyptic. It's anti-nationalism. It's kind of what you'd expect from a school book, to be honest with you, but really not very good. I didn't like it. I actually found, when you write a book and it's I'm going to show working class people or poor people can be more than they're pigeonholed to be, and then you write them in this way, it's almost insulting. In that it's kind of written phonetically, but he never gets his words quite right. And then this dual narrative, as there is in Stone Cold, where he has to switch to Zoe to tell certain aspects of the story, because reading those aspects in Daz's voice would be much weaker and just harder to enjoy because of the way it's written. So it's kind of almost demeaning in a way that's trying to be uplifting. So I didn't like it. I didn't think that it was worthy of study, and I'm going to put it straight into D. The next book that I read was Make Room, Make Room by Harry Harrison, which was filmed as Soylent Green, although the aspect of eating the Soylent Green and it turning out to be people is, spoiler alert, is entirely restricted, or from the film rather. It's not part of the book at all. The book is actually quite similar to Random Acts of senseless violence, in that it depicts a gradually breaking down society. However, the lead character of Random Acts is incredibly relatable and likable in the early goings, particularly like a precocious young girl, which always is going to sort of tug the heartstrings a little better than the guy in Make Room, who's a police officer, and obviously put in a really hard spot. He's trying to do this and he's trying to do that, while at the same time trying to balance his social life. It'd probably be on the cusp of B and C, I think. So C is fair. I'll leave it there at the moment. The next book that I read was Flashman, which I was still working in a library, and they had this book and they were going to throw it away. But I have to say, for a series that lasted a long time, was very popular, I don't think time's been kind to it. I didn't enjoy it at all. I didn't like the lead character at all, and I know that you're not supposed to, but I just found it to be really hard work. And although it is an attempt at an anti-racist book, things have changed. They've moved on a lot since this was written, and with good reason. It kind of is unpleasant. So up to book 21, April or May in the year, maybe a bit later, I was still working in the library and I saw this book on the shelf and I thought, I'll have to check that out, because I do love a murder mystery. But I read P.K. Pinkerton, The Desperados, The Case of the Deadly Desperados. Yeah, it's kind of lighthearted. It's got a decent pace. It's kind of nicely executed. Could have been better. It's hard really to put it anywhere other than in the C's. It's just all right. And the next book was The Shadows of Night. Sorry, I always say Shadows of Night. It's Shallows of Night, and it is Eric Van Lusbader again, his sequel to The Sunset Warrior. And what a massive letdown it was for me. I really didn't like it at all. It seemed so generic. Now, I'll grant you that it was written, I think, in the early 80s, so kind of predates a lot of what has become generic fantasy since. But, oh my God, after the originality of that first one, this was just a slog of just seen it all before cliches, and the fact that the bad guy and the protagonist keep meeting, but because it's book 2, nothing can be resolved. So they keep meeting and then they keep not resolving anything. And in the end, it's like, stop doing this because you're not doing yourself any favours. It's actually getting a bit boring. Talking of murder mysteries, Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon. Decent, influential, enjoyable. I don't have any problems with that being a B. And as I was in the library, and you kind of have young people come in and they're like, what do you recommend? And I'd seen a lot of books for girls going out, but not very many for boys. So I was like, well, what can I recommend to young boys? And Charlie Higson was in the news for criticising the new Bond film. And he's written a number of Bond books, and one of which is called Silverfin. So that's the first that he wrote. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to check that out. And hopefully that's going to be my staple when a young boy comes into the library and says, what can I borrow? What do you recommend? And I can go, definitely James Bond, Charlie Higson. But actually, it was extremely disappointing. It's going into D, the most bland and lifeless prose I've ever read. Just nothing generated any sort of excitement or tension. Very predictable, very low stakes. It didn't even make the most of the fact that it was in that sort of pre-war setting. Just really, really disappointing. And then I picked up the third Philip Marlowe book by Raymond Chandler, The High Window. And I felt that the first one is deservedly regarded as a classic. I thoroughly enjoyed the first one. The second one I felt a little bit more of the same, not quite had that originality, didn't quite have the quirky characters of the first one, didn't quite have that virality of the first one. But the third one, I'd put somewhere between the two. Definitely a return to form. If you could say that the second one was that much of a drop in form, it's up there. I've got no problems at all with putting this in B. Not quite as good as the first one, The Big Sleep. I think we're about halfway through the list. This is turning out to be a long video. Maybe I'll put it into 2 parts. And I have reached The Saliva Tree by Brian Aldiss. Now, I've read Brian Aldiss's History of Science Fiction, the Trillion Year Spree or whatever it's called. So I wanted to see what sort of fiction he wrote. I picked up The Saliva Tree. Well worth checking out. Going into B. Very similar to Lovecraft's The Colour from Out of Space, very similar, and I have to say that if I had to choose between one or the other, I would pick Lovecraft's, but still worthy of a B. It's worth your time checking out. It's not particularly long, it's more of a novella, but quite enjoyable nonetheless. Unlike the next one that I read, which was Aftermath by LeVar Burton, it's not a particularly well executed sort of post-collapse of America, repetitive, boring, uninspired, just not very good. The book's too long. It's hard to recommend it for anything other than like die-hard Star Trek fans. It's not worth more than a D. 39 Steps is there next, written by John Buchan, who is one of those proto-thriller writers, like pre-Hammond Innes, even before MacLean and Bagley came along and built on Innes's work. There was Buchan. This book is tiny. Like my edition of it is not only like tiny this way, but it's very tiny that way. It's a limited word count, I would have thought, very much in the novella sort of range, but really enjoyable. Kind of relies on a little bit too much of a coincidence in the middle. The end could have been a little bit more exciting, a bit more action-packed. I think that Bagley and MacLean would have had something more vibrant and energetic in that finale, but still a really good thriller, so worthy of a B. The 29th book that I read in 2022 was Ringworld by Larry Niven, which obviously I've already mentioned that I really enjoyed The Legacy of Heorot, so I was really keen to see what else he had written, and this is highly recommended. It's another one of those sci-fi masterworks editions as well, so it's like, wow, I was so excited, and because of that, as much as anything, I feel like just didn't come up to what I was expecting. I'm going to put it in C. I think a lot of people have it high. It's a very interesting piece of world building, but the story itself on that planet is kind of lackluster. Basically, it's a travel book, and I'm documented as not particularly liking them. This is one of the more stronger science fiction examples of it, but I still would have liked to have seen so much more. Next book I read was The Searchers by Alan LeMay. If I'm wrong about that, please forgive me. The book that inspired the classic John Wayne film, but I have to say that there are aspects of the film that once you've read the book, you go, why did they do that? Why did they do that? The tone of that is just really wrong. For example, the point where, I can't remember the guy's name, he's not John Wayne, but he's searching with John Wayne, and then he goes back and he gets into like a brawl in the village that's played out for comedy, and the guy that owns the ranch is like a really strange, daft, jokey sort of character in the film. It's just really not right. If you've read the book, that guy is there. He's like a solid, dependable, sort of typical Western pioneer. As far as I can tell, there are not any jokes in the book. There are aspects of John Wayne's character in the film which are just like perfectly cast at that time of his life to play that role. And there are things that he does in his performance that sort of encapsulates things in the book that aren't even sort of said, they're almost unsaid, like subtext. And his performance is incredible. But I almost would go as far as to say that the book is better than the film. And given the reputation of that film, that's saying something. And then I'm going to go, but there are also issues with the book in that it does almost, I mean, I know you're kind of, it's going to go on a long time to show that these guys are carrying on this search, but it did feel just a little bit too long. It felt a little bit, because there's a lot of back and forth, almost gets repetitive a little bit. So I'm going to put it in B, not A. Which, when you say it's better than the film that's considered like a masterpiece, like that's really opening yourself up for some criticism. Hopefully I'll be forgiven for it. Hopefully what I've said made sense. So the next book was Berlin Wall Affair by Troy Conway, which is, I guess you'd call it, an attempt at an erotic comedy, slightly thriller. But in actual fact, having read it, I didn't find it to be erotic, and I certainly didn't find it to be funny. It's about a guy that goes to Germany in the Cold War to investigate a neo-Nazi ring in the hope of stopping them from provoking a Soviet attack in East Berlin, which would cause World War III. So actually the mystery part of it has a good basis, and it might actually be quite a good thriller in other hands, but it's just bogged down with feeble sex and very little of it even raised a smile, let alone a laugh. It's just not funny. So it's just not very good. So that's a D. Then I went on and read John Sadden's Mudlark, which is set in my hometown of Portsmouth, which makes me feel favourably towards it. It's set during World War I. There's a murder mystery. Lots of young local girls are dying, and their bodies are being found, and there's that sort of mystery about it of who did it. I would have liked a more satisfying, it was him sort of ending. But the two leads have huge chemistry. They're really likeable, really enjoyable book. I highly recommend it. I'm going to put it into B, which some might feel is generous. Perhaps it's getting a hometown boost, but I do recommend it highly enough to feel that it's warranted. The next book was one I've been looking for a long time, Bernard Cornwell's Sharpe's Eagle, the first in the Sharpe series. Sharpe's a decent lead, got a good cast of friends and support around him. The villain here, I was like, it's bigged up in the intro like it's the best villain. I was kind of like, not really. Only in about 3 scenes, incompetent in them. But still builds towards a very satisfying conclusion in a way that, if you were thinking of writing this sort of military book, should probably serve as your blueprint. Easy to put in a B. This next book is by William Smits. It's The Coffee Thief, which I think is a phenomenal title. It's set in Indonesia. It's about a man who is accused of stealing coffee, and he actually technically did do it, but in such small amounts it's not really worth worrying about. But the reason that he's accused of it is because they wanted him on something else. They wanted him for murder, but his lawyer basically proves that it wasn't him, but they're still like, well, we want him for something, so they get him for this, and then he escapes and joins like an underground against I think Dutch colonists. The criticism that I have of this book is that it's not longer, in that I want to see more. I want to see the relationship build between the lead and sort of the love interest. I want to see more of the underground working against I feel easily that this book, which I think is like novella length, it's not long, it's like 150, 200 pages, but I really think that it could easily be 400 and be better for it. And the book's split into two kind of sections, and I think that it needed the middle one, which is skipped over. It's a couple of years and the book just skips over them, but I wanted to see that. The next book might also fall into that category of Death by Expectation. It's written by Rob Grant, who's one of the two writers of sort of what you would consider classic Red Dwarf, that early sort of seasons 1 to 6. And that is some of my all-time favourite comedy. I absolutely love that early Red Dwarf. The first couple of lines are phenomenal. I absolutely loved them. And I was like, oh my God, this is like one of my comedy heroes has written this. These first lines are amazing. And then after that, it was all downhill and I just didn't like any part of it. So that's going in D, not even a question in my mind. The next book is another film tie-in. It was Dragonheart, which at times tries to build a little on what's in the film, but then at other times it kind of skirts through some of it. Again, like the film, it's like I kind of like David Thewlis as an actor. In that film, I'm torn between, like, he does have some good lines and some good interactions with his minions, but is he really a menacing bad guy or a scary bad guy or even that sort of cerebral bad guy? And I don't think he ever is quite any of those. And that weakness is very much present in the book as well. Not difficult to put into C. And if you're putting that in C, then we'll move on to a book that should be thrown into the C, which is The Lady of the Shroud by Bram Stoker, which is an absolute shocker. Oh my God, is it bad? Really, really, really bad. So incredibly boring. I mean, it actually gets sort of better towards the end, and I think that Bram Stoker was trying to do something which Richard Marsh had done in 1896 with The Beetle, which is sort of swap about genres and write like a mystery and a romance and then a war book. But the problem is the first 50 pages are an entirely verboten reciting of an old man's will. And I do wonder how many people picked up this book and didn't get through that section. I mean, I have staying power when it comes to books. It's very rare that I'll stop a book. But I most definitely was close. Probably the closest of any book in the year, probably 2 or 3 years that I can recall since I was that close to just going, I'm not reading any more of this. What is the point of this? Like I say, it does get a little bit better towards the end, but it's still not enough to elevate it above a D. Which is where we'll find our next book, which is another comedy legend writing dross. Eric Idle's Road to Mars. Shocker. Really poor. One good scene where a planet sort of that's been terraformed almost, but they live under a dome and the dome cracks. That's the only good scene. Everything else is abysmal, not funny, just dull. Really, really poor. Eric Idle. It hurts to even say that it's not brilliant. It's a D. Thankfully, after that little run of dross, I read something that actually made me feel like it's worth picking books up. They're a worthy investment of my time, because I was beginning to wonder. It's Robert Bloch's Psycho. This book predates the film, so it inspired the film. Really good. Really builds on that character in slightly different ways to the films. Like, you don't quite have that shock. I would love to have read this book without having already seen the film. So anyone that's come to the book first, I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts were on this. But yeah, really easily recommendable book. The next book I read was Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which I was really looking forward to. I hadn't read any Burroughs for a little while. Last one I read was Tarzan. Loved that. Thought that I would try the Barsoom series, but obviously starting at the beginning. And this is the first one. And I do think that in terms of creating a world, at the time that this was written, this would have been extraordinary. My main thing that I would say about it is that I just think that science fiction has moved on. I think that the generation that came after Burroughs admittedly built on what Burroughs did, but I think that people like Asimov, Bradbury, Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke just did it better. That it was easier for them. I still recommend this, but I recommend it mostly on the grounds of how influential it was, of how seminal it was, like the first or one of the earliest ones to do this sort of thing. So that's kind of where my recommendation comes from. So as a book in its own right, I'm going to put it in C. Just remember that within C there are variations of there's a good C, a strong C, a really recommended C, and then there's that C that's kind of like, you're not quite bad enough to be a D. Princess of Mars is a good C. My next book, there's a lot of science fiction this year, not very much fantasy, is there, but a lot of science fiction, and this is no exception because it's Rogue Ship by A.E. Van Vogt. As books go, this is something a bit special. It really, really races along. Like 3-4 generations of the same family are gone in like 30 pages. But it isn't one of those books where you go, I was just getting to like him. It's one of those books where it loses perhaps its chief and nastiest and most interesting villain, or perhaps even just most interesting character, a little bit too early. That's the only criticism I would say. Absolutely rips along. If you're a fan of Robert Heinlein, I think that you'll really like Rogue Ship. Just relentlessly entertaining, really good. That sort of has something to say about mankind, it's sort of the way we repeat our own mistakes over and over and over. So yeah, I definitely recommend Rogue Ship. Really good. I just picked it up on a whim in a bookshop, and I was just like, yeah, wow. Perhaps that comes from the expectations again. I had none, and it blew me away. And everything that I've gone into thinking this is gonna be great has been really poor. The next book was If Only They Could Talk, which by James Herriot, which is a pseudonym. I can't remember the guy's actual real name. He was a genuine vet, and he wrote about his experiences. This was released in America as a double bill, and it's called It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet, or something like that. All Creatures Great and Small. It's one of the two, but those titles are also used for TV series and things like that in the UK that are based on this series of books. Starts off slowly. I actually found it to be surprisingly dour and dark, the first couple of sort of anecdotes that are related. And that really is all of the book is a series of anecdotes. Some of the anecdotes really, really land. Really, really land. They're great fun. And some are just a little bit... So I'm going to give it a B because when it works, it really, really does work. And it's a very amiable and likeable sort of book. The next book is Ed McBain's noir thriller, crime, murder mystery, whatever you want to call it, The Gutter and the Grave. It isn't quite Chandler-esque in terms of sort of snappy wit, but it is still a decent mystery. A little bit predictable, but well done. It's quite interesting to see how things were done in the police. Back then, there was a bit where they arrest this guy, and they're like... There are two of them, but one of them gets away and one of them's arrested, and it's like, how are we going to get the other guy? Well, we're just going to beat this guy until he tells us who he is. It's like, oh yeah, police used to do that. Probably not the best way of policing in more modern times, but it's quite interesting to see it being done and not being like horrifically judged for it. The next book is The Killer Mind by Hammond Innes. I'm going to put it in C, and I'm going to put it in C because at times it's genuinely exciting, but yeah, I feel like it could have just been so much more. The situation of being trapped underground is a fairly common phobia. A lot of people share that, and if you were the best in that genre, the best book about being trapped underground, I think that, and also Hammond Innes' sort of position in the sort of masculine thriller genre, you think that he might be the guy to deliver on that. But this is sort of like, it's a half-decent mystery about his family history and a little bit of being trapped underground in his mind. But there isn't explosively brilliant in either of those categories. The last one is Alan Dean Foster's Interlopers, which I have a review of. If it's not up when you're watching this, it will be very shortly afterwards. It's science fiction, but it's kind of about archaeologists. And the archaeologist discovers a potion which allows him to see things that no one else can see. But what he sees is that we're all kind of walking around possessed, a little bit like Scientology. We've got these interlopers that sort of affect us. Not everybody, but most people. And they sort of make us angry when we shouldn't be, or they make us do stupid things when we shouldn't. He's got a great idea that he doesn't know what story he wants to tell. Certainly not a bad book. In fact, for the year 2000, I used to read Alan Dean Foster when it was Spellsinger, which I assumed early 90s, perhaps even late 80s, I was sort of really into Alan Dean Foster. Read a lot of his books, and the sort of great concept, not really well executed, is kind of a staple I found in his work, in that quite often you'd be, that's a great idea, where's he going with that? And then it's quite clear that he doesn't know either. So yeah, I'm going to put it in C. It's not the best book that he's ever written. It's absolutely nowhere near the worst book he's ever written. 45 books in 1 year. I think that must be wrong, because I'm pretty sure that I read a book a week. But if there was something else that slipped through the cracks, I'm afraid I've forgotten it. And 45 in a year is not bad. Yeah, so if you've read any of those, by all means share your thoughts in the comments. If you disagree with my ranking of something that you've read, by all means tell me why in the comments. In the meantime, liking and subscribing is the way to get more of this sort of thing.